Shelley?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation to come online today and to speak to all of you. This is my passion, and I hope you all enjoy this presentation. As Shonali said at the very end, I will leave some room for a discussion and also any questions. I will quickly introduce myself, and then I would love to jump into this so I'm not wasting any time. My name is Marwa Hassanien. Just a quick background about myself is that I am a first-generation American, daughter of immigrants from Egypt. They came to the U.S. Over 40 years ago in search of the American dream. My parents got their master's and PhDs from here. They're both engineers and never made it back to Egypt. And so as a child living in Oklahoma, of all places, I was very attuned to equity and inclusion and diversity, being bilingual and bicultural, straddling two cultures, and in my opinion, getting the best of both worlds. And so fast forward to my adult years, I moved to Maine with my husband, who is a physician. He was a J-1 visa holder, so also an immigrant. But he came here because it's a medically underserved area. We are in Bangor. And the caveat is you work here for 3 years and he was able to get his green card and citizenship, and then you're free to go anywhere in the US that you want. And initially we thought we'd move to California or Florida, but we've been here 17 years now. And so we've really established roots. We have 4 children now who have gone through the Bangor school system or currently in the Bangor school system. So I really enjoy, doing a lot of these presentations. I am the DEI system director for Northern Light Health. And so I work for the entire system. So all the hospitals for Northern Light Health are right under me. So I do very similar presentations about equity and inclusion and how to really foster inclusivity. I'm also the chair of the Bangor School Committee, in which I brought a lot of this work also to our students and to our staff. I just presented actually yesterday, and it was wonderful to have these discussions with our principals and administrators. And so I wear many, many hats, but this is, again, a passion of mine because I understand it very, very well. And so with that, I would love to jump into this. What I'll do is I will give a brief, if I can get this to go, maybe. Okay, here we go. I will give a brief didactic piece. I will try to rush through the dry, boring stuff, but I think it's also really important to really understand many of these DEI terms and why this work is so important. And then, of course, leaving some room and some time for a discussion. I would love for this to be as informal as possible, and I will invite you all to unmute yourselves and put your videos on and to join me for a really fruitful and hopefully a productive conversation as well. In terms of laying the groundwork and why this work is so important, I see it with many organizations, not just in healthcare, but also in our schools. Many organizations from like the Bangor Symphony Orchestra to LL to immigration services, they've all reached out to me for help with their organizations. And it's wonderful. Why? Because Maine is not a racially or ethnically diverse state, as we all know. 95% of our population is white. And so we really need to elevate these issues in order to make our state more inclusive and equitable. As I mentioned in the beginning, I love Maine, and that's why we've stayed here. We made this home because people are so welcoming and have been so wonderful. Are things absolutely perfect? No, I don't think any place is perfect. There's always room for improvement, and this is what this work is about. Research shows us that celebrating diversity and creating these organizational principles that really kind of align DEI, culturally literate and respectful of differences is the aim for this work. Not only are we respecting and valuing individuals' various and intersectional, racial, ethnic, sexual, age, and gender differences, but we're also kind of pivoting where before, taking a color blind approach was appropriate and we ignored identity-based differences. Well, research shows us now that that is actually not adequate anymore. We really need to respect differences and not take a color blind approach any longer. One of the key things to do within this work is to understand DEI terms. I'm sure many of you are well acquainted with the DEI terms, but with even my own staff members, that acronym that we throw around so often, DEI, some people confuse those. They think E stands for, equality versus equity, and what even is the difference between equity and equality, and why are those terms used interchangeably? So we'll get into all of that. Knowledge is power, and this is what we're all doing. And I consider myself a lifelong student. I learn every day like you all as well. I don't consider myself a subject matter expert, although I am DEI certified by Cornell and by Yale University, but I will be a lifelong student of this work. I'll get into what we can do as parents and educators, neighbors, leaders, and community leaders. It really is important for all of us to begin this process of education and self-reflection, really looking deep down into our souls to kind of figure out what biases we hold, what we can push back on in order to effect positive change. We really need to be more awakened to the struggles of those in marginalized communities, and what exactly do they face on a daily basis. Again, as I mentioned, here in Maine, I've seen such tremendous work, again, in all facets of our community, but really more work, I believe, needs to be done to bring forth systemic change, to really understand systemic issues and bring the whole workforce, our entire community, into alignment with ideal cultural norms. So this work takes a lot of empathy. It is difficult work to do, but I really challenge each and every one of us to have courage to do that internal work. That takes addressing these difficult, uncomfortable issues oftentimes rather than avoiding them, and then leaning into the discomfort oftentimes that takes place with issues like this. But I do believe that if we do so, then we allow everyone to bring their true, authentic selves to work, to school, to our workforce, etc. So with that, I would love to kind of touch on some of the DEI terms that I know are thrown around so often. And so I just love to kind of peel these apart: diversity, equity, and inclusion, kind of talk about what they mean, what they stand for, and why it's important to, again, start with this fundamental and foundational basis of DEI. So diversity, if we have, the beginning of this equation, diversity is the what. It constitutes all the characteristics that make each and every one of us unique. And oftentimes when I talk about diversity, people assume that I'm talking just about race or ethnicity. And while that is included, that's not the entire picture. We want to look at the totality of the picture. Diversity includes everyone in its broad scope, meaning gender, religious beliefs, race, ethnicity, age. Ageism is a huge one, especially in a healthcare system like the one I work with and work in. Sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, appearance, abilities, and disabilities. Socioeconomic status is huge within our school system in Bangor. 73% of our students are on low and reduced meals. And so socioeconomic status, people don't realize that's a huge portion of our student population that I often address. And that is part of this diversity circle here. So with diversity, there are primary dimensions and there are secondary dimensions. Primary ones are typically ones that we don't have control over, our race, our age, ethnicity, our gender, etc. Secondary dimensions, typically we have more control over them, and that's the outer circle here that you see, our marital status, religious beliefs, geographical location, education, etc. And oftentimes, there are gray areas, and it's not as black or white as I make them, but that's a whole different conversation. But for that, I think it's very, very important that we put intentional focus on traditionally marginalized individuals in our society, and that includes women. I talk a lot about gender equity and differences in pay and so forth. So women, disabled individuals, those in the LGBTQ plus communities, racial and ethnic groups, some religious groups as well. And so I think it's really important to highlight that if we mirror the communities, the students, the families that we work with, then we can understand and really anticipate the diverse needs of those populations that we work with and we serve. And that's important for me as a director of a huge system. We have over 12,000 employees and have a head of a school board with over 3,000 students. A great many live on the margins of society, and they do not fit that mainstream culture or a certain mold. And so I always remember that, the privileges that I personally hold and how I can use my privilege to really help and uplift and leverage those who may be less privileged than myself. So that's really here the bottom line of DEI. I know DEI work is so polarized sometimes, it's so politicized. I'm not in on that. I'm more into really seeing where the voids are. How can we help individuals within our healthcare system using the social determinants of health to really help patient outcomes, and within our schools, how to really look at the voids, if it's socioeconomic status or religious beliefs, gender, whatever it may be, where the voids are there, and to really help and benefit everyone involved. So we talked about diversity being the what, then equity then must be the why. Equity, and again, as I mentioned in the beginning, equity and equality are oftentimes confused. They're oftentimes used interchangeably. Equity is, equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and then allocates those resources and opportunities needed to reach equal outcome. So individual needs are taken into account and treated accordingly, and many diverse needs that I come across. Equality says basically that everyone is at the same level and deserves the same treatment, and people should be given the same resources or opportunities, but we disregard any individual differences, any needs, or any specific requirements. And that can be extremely problematic. And that's the difference really between equity and equality. In workplaces, in schools, and in many different sectors in our community, we must continuously evaluate our policies, our practices, our procedures, our protocols, in order to identify and remove the root causes of inequities. And working very closely on policy within schools, there are still many inequities, and I'm actually elevating those at the state level right now and working with legislators on that to make sure that we interrupt these biases and make sure that we are equitable. And I think the best image, and I love this image. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this image right here, this picture that I have. And it really depicts, I think it depicts it very well, the difference between equity and equality. And in the first image, it is assumed here with the three individuals, it is assumed that they will benefit from the same supports. So here in this first picture here, they are treated equally. And then if we go to the second image, the individuals are given different supports that make it possible for them to have equal access here to the game. So they're being treated equitably. So each person, depending on their needs, our little guy our littlest guy is given more resources in order to level out the playing field, if you will. And then the last image here is what I am trying to achieve. This is what I work really, really hard on, is that we remove the supports, anything that is a barrier. Here it was the fence that depicts or symbolizes the inequity. So we are removing the cause of inequity, we address it, we support those needs, and we remove it completely. Again, the systemic barrier has been removed in this case, and that's what we want. We must level the playing field by equipping our students with, and our teachers and our administrators with the knowledge and power to make sure that each and every student is successful. And really eliminating disparities here is by eliminating those disparities and those roadblocks and those barriers, then are we able to make sure that each and every student has equitable access in our schools, regardless, again, of their social characteristics and their social identities, whatever that may be. So we have the what and the why, then inclusion then must be the how in this equation. Inclusion really puts the concept and practice of diversity into action, and it creates environments of inclusivity and belonging. And just recently in our schools, we have added B at the end of DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And that's what is really, really important. This work allows for belonging. It allows for our students to come to school to be their true, authentic selves, whatever that looks like, and feel supported by their staff and their teachers and their fellow classmates. And that's why it's really important for us as teachers and as parents and as community members and as neighbors to really be behind this work and to uplift every single student. Inclusion ensures that, again, everyone feels supported and valued. If someone's from a different country, if someone's from a different state here in the U.S., if someone, is male or female or non-binary or trans, we have a lot of those students. And so making sure that we uplift all of those students, all of those voices. If we have students of low socioeconomic status, figuring out how to best help them. Again, this enables diversity to thrive. It helps truly bring those students into our classrooms in order to fully participate. But it does require deliberate and intentional action on our part. And in that, it, again, includes every single voice from those marginalized communities. And our schools, our organizations, our communities must be free from any type of bias, any type of discrimination and intolerance. And I really don't like that word intolerance. It really is for us to say that we are tolerating someone, I feel is like a bare minimum. I think we need to, again, make sure that everyone is included. We need all those voices at our table. We need, all different perspectives to be included as well. So that's the DEI part of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I would also love to jump into unconscious bias, because again, once we understand that acronym, then it branches into all these different topics. And this is one that I often talk about. It's a very, very important one. Biases kind of happen to every single one of us. Oftentimes I'm challenged by colleagues who say, nope, I do not have a bias. I'm a good person. And I believe people when they tell me that. I believe we are all good people. For the most part, yes, there are those who are malicious, but for the most part, I do not believe that people truly have bias, intentional bias, or malice. Sorry, I meant to say malice. Sorry. But these are called unconscious bias for a reason. Unconscious bias is defined as attributes that we quickly assign to people based on their social categories. And they're the same ones that I identified already: race, ethnicity, age, religion, sexual orientation. And these are the surface level characteristics and not the deeper level one of personality, et cetera. The ones that are protected by affirmative action laws and equal employment laws, et cetera. And these biases exist without us even realizing that we have them. And they're called unconscious for a reason. They happen at a level well below our level of awareness. And as I mentioned, we all have them. If we are human, we have these biases despite our moral compass. You know, again, I believe I'm a good person. I have a strong moral compass, but I have recognized the biases that I have and the ones that I hold by doing a lot of soul searching. And I've even taken implicit bias tests, and I'll talk about that at the end. But we can take these implicit bias tests to kind of gauge where our biases are, especially those of us who, you know, we may not know what our biases are, or we don't believe we have a bias. Again, it does not make us bad people. Why do we have them? They actually result from our neural connections within our brains and how our brains are basically structured over time. So it's a coping mechanism. It's a way that our brains have evolved over time to help us survive. And I can't imagine really, how we would have survived had we not had these mental structures in our brains to really kind of help us survive and function throughout the day. Scientists estimate that we are bombarded by at least 11 million pieces of information at any given time. So imagine, the social media, the interactions that we go through in a day, the interactions, maybe watching TV and so forth. But our brains can only process 40 bits of that information at our time. So our brains filter information that seems familiar by using these pre-existing knowledge structures in our brains. So it's almost like a mental file. That's how I kind of imagine it being in our brains, something that we go to in order to help us out in any type of situation. That is helpful, but it can also be highly problematic. And this is why we need to recognize that and make sure that we are cognizant of the fact we believe what we see is objective and not that it has been impacted by our brain's interpretation. And this can really affect, how we see people. We may interpret someone as being likable, competent, and safe, or not likable, incompetent, or unsafe. And so again, it's due to that, the mental structures in our brains, and also cultural conditioning that we have had throughout our upbringing and so forth. And so these are things that we need to pay attention to. A quick example is a study that was done with over 1,000 elementary aged students who were asked to describe what it would have been if they had been born a member of the opposite sex. And a majority of the girls said that they would have preferred to have been born as a boy because boys are faster and stronger and they just have it easier in life. And 95% of boys, and you may have guessed it, said, no, there's no advantage to being a girl. I'm good. And so what this study really showed us and showed researchers is that these biases exist at a very young age. And this is exactly why we try to interrupt the biases at a young age before they become microaggressions and before they're truly solidified within our children. And that's something that I work a lot on with with our youth is interrupting these biases, because they do affect our expectations and our perceptions of those who we interact with, even for our children. And I'll talk about the difference between discussing it with our children versus shaming them. And we always want to make sure that we avoid shaming our children. And it's something that, we discuss this with them, but it's also, we focus on the behavior and things that are said and not the individual, not the person who is saying the things. And so we'll get into that here in a little bit. So I discussed unconscious bias and how they affect behavior and interactions with our colleagues and our neighbors and our students and our friends, but they can also lead to microaggressions. And that's what makes it really, really important about pushing back and interrupting the biases before they manifest into a microaggression. There are many, many definitions of the word. If you look up this word microaggression, you'll come across many definitions, but this is one of my favorite ones. It was given by Dr. Sue, who is a professor of counseling psychology at Columbia, and he describes or defines microaggressions as brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, and environmental assaults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults that potentially have harmful or unpleasant psychological impact on a person or a group of people. And I really want to highlight whether intentional or unintentional, because that's really, really important. These microaggressions are based on people's social identities, again, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, ability, age, sexual orientation, etc. And a lot of people with microaggressions, a lot of people, deflect criticism about their oppressive language or behavior, making it about their intent. So I get that when I'm investigating a complaint, individuals will typically say to me, well, I never meant any harm, Marwa. It was never my intention. I'm not a racist. I'm not a sexist. I'm not a homophobe. And again, as I mentioned, I really believe, I believe that when they say that, because usually when I investigate it more and so forth, people are extremely regretful and remorseful and apologetic. But we really need to be mindful and teach our children to be mindful of intent and impact. Oftentimes, intent does not equal the impact that it has on people. Whereas the perpetrator views intent, the recipient always views impact. And again, intent does not equal impact. Microaggressions typically have positive intent, and that's the part that makes me sad, because oftentimes people are extremely apologetic. They feel bad because something that they said does have positive intent. And I typically tell people it's okay. We are human. I'm certified in doing this work. I've been doing it for a long, long time, and I make mistakes on a daily basis. And so it's really important. And so that's the shame resilience piece that I want to talk about as well, is that we don't want people to feel, ashamed and feel so bad about themselves. And that's not what DEIB work is meant for. It's not meant to really make us feel bad about ourselves and feel so shameful that we just don't want to do this work. No, it's about being mindful, recognizing the impact, the negative impact that some of the things that we say or do may have on those around us. But it's a matter of us just apologizing and owning it. It's really, really important to own. If someone tells you, ouch, that what you just said offended me, and instead of us being defensive and being really kind of, making it about us and our intent. Well, I didn't mean that. I didn't say that. You're blowing things out of proportion. Just pause and apologize. I am sorry. Thank you for letting me know that was offensive. I did not know, and I will make sure that I don't say that again or do that again. And that's really what we are teaching our children and teaching even staff members at work, is that We are human. We will make mistakes. That is guaranteed. And it's just, being mindful again of others and their, their feelings and their emotions as well. And the same thing I would want for myself. If I told someone, that you just hurt my feelings, or this was, that was offensive, I would want someone to validate my feelings as well. Perceived, so that's something really important, that oftentimes there is that perception of minimal harm, but we don't realize there's cumulative effects. There is oftentimes lack of knowledge of that, especially for those who are in marginalized communities. Sometimes, these wounds are so small, but Dr. Sue actually describes microaggressions as a death by 1,000 wounds. And that every time I read that quote, it just gives me chills, because we really don't realize that someone may have so many small wounds that that cumulative effect is a lot more severe than we even realize. And so that's what really makes me kind of review my actions and review my my biases. I check them on a daily basis before I leave home, because I know that something that I say, as small as it may seem to me, may be profound and a lot bigger than I even realize for someone else. Microaggressions, especially with adults, have been linked to increased depression, anxiety, and high blood pressure. Even for adults, it impacts job satisfaction and self-esteem and mental and physical health. And so when I talk to my workforce and my staff members, we talk a lot about recruitment and retention and, filling all the vacancies that we have at work. And I oftentimes point to microaggressions and biases and working on that as a group and as a staff in different staff meetings in different departments, in order to make sure that we really rectify this and make sure that we work on retention by eradicating as much as possible. It's, again, we're human, but making sure that we work on unconscious bias and microaggressions. And really just remembering that when it comes to people's lives and their identities, the impact of our actions and our words can be profound and wide-reaching. And so really recognizing that it's not about our intent, but about the impact that can further marginalize and oppress those around us. Now, being mindful of the time, but I did want to give some examples of microaggressions, and that's something that people ask me, you gave us a definition, we talked about it, but I want concrete examples. And these are concrete examples that oftentimes happen, usually, amongst us as adults, but even with our children, sometimes, things are said or are disregarded, and sometimes it really affects our children in a way that is not intended to affect it in that way. Some examples I like to give is, expressing racially charged opinions, and especially within elections. We just finished an election cycle, and so oftentimes things are said that can be very offensive or hurtful. Mispronouncing names and continuing to mispronounce names. And I talk to a lot of our teachers about that, because if you have a student with a different name and it's spelled differently and it sounds differently, maybe ethnically different or even regionally different, or whatever the case may be, we want to make sure that we are pronouncing names. Names are important for identities. It's something with a great sense of pride for many families. And so, people don't expect us to always pronounce names correctly, but it's a matter of just, for a teacher to ask her student or his student or their student, how do you pronounce your name? And maybe writing it the way they hear it phonetically. And in that way, they make sure that they pronounce it. I've had numerous complaints about teachers who, westernize names or try to either, abbreviate names or change them. And it's really offensive to students, even if they don't say so. But I'm telling the student, I'm giving the message to my student that, your name is just too hard for me to pronounce. And so I'm going to change it the way I want to change it, versus really giving them, again, that pride in their name and their identity. And I shared this with this group before with the staff members that, I came across someone with the name Ashley, but she spelled it Ashleigh. And even that, I assumed it was Ashley, but I just wanted to make sure. So I paused and I asked her to pronounce her name for me. So again, just little things like that we can do to really affirm those who are in front of us. It gives them a lot of dignity and respect, and it shows them that we value who they are. So that's a big one oftentimes that has, we have positive intent. We don't mean to offend someone, but oftentimes it's very offensive if we continue to mispronounce or pronounce names. Asking families or telling families who are possibly immigrants who have accents, telling them things like, you speak English well. You are so articulate, and for many immigrants, they speak, 2, 3, 4, oftentimes 5 different languages, and they're very articulate and very well spoken. So by me saying you speak English well, then I'm telling them that I assumed they didn't speak English well because of their strong accents. And so again, oftentimes that is used as a conversation starter or as a compliment, but that is one that can be hurtful as well. Asking, individuals, are you married yet? Do you have children? Asking people, where are you from? And that's a big one. That is one I have to admit trips people up. They always say to me, well, Marwa, that's something that I ask, any individual, where are you from? But oftentimes it is asked of people of color, for people who have accents, and they may be American, or and even if they are not American, the way that is phrased, where are you from, really others people. It pushes them away, and it makes them feel like there's no sense of belonging. You do not belong here. And I've had an African American individual say that someone said, where are you from? And they're like, seriously, I'm from here. And someone who is indigenous, and someone asked them, where are you from? And so we can see how that can be extremely problematic. And so a different way to ask something like this, if we want to really inquire about someone's background, is ask open-ended questions. Asking questions like, I'd love to know a little bit more about, your cultural heritage, your background. Tell me a little bit more about yourself. Again, those open-ended questions leaves the ball in the court of the responder, allowing them a chance to tell you what they want to tell you instead of using that othering language. And oftentimes, even people from different states, around the US are very bothered by this question because we're telling them, you don't belong here in Maine. Where are you really from? So that's a clear example of intent versus impact. The intent may be positive, but the impact is still negative. Continuing, assuming gender or misusing pronouns. This is something that we are tackling now in our schools, with misuse of pronouns. If someone gives you pronouns and we continue to misuse their pronouns, that's again, extremely offensive, especially with the trans community that we work with. We know through research that this is suicide prevention when we give honor and give respect and not misuse pronouns. Not if, someone tells you this is my dead name and I no longer want to use this name, I'm using this name now. We need to be respectful of that. And gender is the same thing. And then we get into legalities. It's quite complicated at a public school system because we get into legalities and where parents are in this. And we've had to pull in our lawyer, our legal team to answer questions for us there. But again, I think for me, it boils down to, again, respect and really helping elevate students. Mental health, especially after COVID-19, is on the rise. And so for me, the bottom line is to really help individuals, meet them where they are and try to uplift them more so than in trying to get it right, especially legally. I leave that for the lawyers, but for me, it's really about helping and touching hearts and making sure that I uplift all students and staff that work with them. Disregarding different religious traditions. That's a big one, especially around Christmas time, around the holidays. I know many of us now are not calling it, we call it holiday time, happy holidays and so forth. And just being, my philosophy is do not remove things, but add more. So I'm against the idea or the notion that we have to remove a Christmas tree or, I'm completely against that. I'm for let's add more. Let's add, more festive decorations from all faith traditions, opening it up, allowing us to be more inclusive. I've really kind of incorporated that in our school system and in our healthcare system too. And it's been wonderful. People are very appreciative of the more is better versus taking things away where we feel like we're losing a part of us. Every single one of us wants to feel included, but we don't want things to feel like a piece of our the things that we love, whether it's secular or religious, whatever it may be. We don't want to feel like that has been stripped away from us. But again, being mindful that there are students who are not Christian and who maybe have no faith tradition at all, being mindful of their feelings as well. And making sure that we recognize people's backgrounds and that we don't make assumptions about backgrounds. And of course, that has to do with socioeconomic status. And I will move on just for time. And so each and every one of us plays a role, whether you are an ally, whether you're an educator, if you're a parent, a guardian, then you are a role model for our students. If you're neighbors and community members, we all play a role in this, and it starts with us, each and every one of us examining our own internal biases, again, that inform our thoughts and our actions. If we really dig deep into that, and it is uncomfortable, I admit, none of us want to think of ourselves as having a bias because we think that is, again, will make us bad people. I challenge that. I push back on that to just say that each and every one of us is human. If again, we are human, so we do have these biases. But we can, once we know what they are, we can interrupt them. We can push back on the microaggressions before they manifest and harm those around us. Privilege is another big word that I love talking about. That's a whole another presentation that I have. Oftentimes people don't like that word privilege because, again, it makes us think that there's something that we should be ashamed of. I argue that if we know where we hold power and privilege, then we can use that. We can use our power and privilege to help those who are less privileged than ourselves. So that recognition is really, really important in order to break down those barriers that create inequities. And making sure that each and every one of our students and our faculty and staff and community members are truly valued and seen and heard and empowered. That's, again, what this DEIB work is all about. Not to shame any one of us, not to shame our students, That's a big, big misconception that I really want to break down, because this work is just really to uplift every single voice, regardless of what that voice looks like and what it is. So again, self-reflection, reading up on common biases against identity groups, familiarizing ourselves with what's out there, identifying those sentiments make it a lot easier. And then it'll help us again recognize the bias as it manifests itself today. Listening to our students. Common challenges are typically expressed by our students. So let's spend time with people who are not like them or not like ourselves. That will help us a lot in recognizing our biases, and then again working on noticing those biases with ourselves and our colleagues and amongst our students. Practicing micro affirmations. We affirm the different views and perspectives. Doesn't mean that we always have to agree with one another. Again, that's a big misconception that we always have to agree with one another. It means that we just respect one another and give each and every one of us the dignity that we deserve. And I promised that I would leave 10 to 15 minutes for discussion and answer. So I would love to open it up for a question and answer session, or just maybe a group discussion. I would love to hear from you all, and here are just some questions. We don't have to answer these. I always just pose them to get a discussion going. But, thinking of people who are your role models when it comes to promoting equity and inclusion, who is this person and what do you admire most about this type of person? What does an ideal organization or school look like for you? And do you feel that the ideal is too far off from what is already in place in terms of equity and inclusion and diversity? Just some questions about, do you spend time with people whose beliefs are different than yours? And how well do you think you understand where they're coming from? Do you allow that understanding to take place? And do you have genuine appreciation for who people are as individuals? And these are questions that we can kind of take and think about later on. It doesn't have to be tonight. But with that, the floor is open. Please feel free again to unmute yourselves and use the chat function. I would love to hear from any of you and all of you.
And Marwa, I'm going to say that I'm going to stop recording at this point so that people can feel comfortable having themselves on video and their voices on video. So I'm going to just stop the recording.
Sure.